I really like your book
Thank
for
you.
a lot of reasons. Because for one reason, it revives the meaning of the word coalition. In politics today, everybody throws that word around, coalition, but a bunch of people in a room who already agree with each other isn't really a coalition, is it?
That's exactly right. You've got to bring people together who disagree about things. And I do feel that some of us collectively, some Americans, lost track of that in recent years. We want everyone to agree with us about everything. And some people, I think particularly on the political left in recent years, have tended to ostracize people if they disagreed with them about something or used the wrong terms or whatever. Lincoln took a totally different approach. He was trying to find people that he could have common ground with, or even if he didn't have common ground, he would engage with them. He'd talk with them. He'd try to get something out of the interaction.
You even write at one point, quote, Republicans needed people, the Republican Party at the time, very early in its formation, needed people whose views Lincoln considered repugnant.
Yeah.
I'm guessing he didn't win them over by calling them repugnant.
No, not at all. And it's one of the trickier parts of his story. Lincoln was an anti-slavery candidate. It's before the Civil War. You're right, the Republican Party was brand new, and he was one of the relatively early Republicans. But it was a time when people had lots of different views about slavery, and it was hard to get a majority for any one view of what to do about it, if anything. And Lincoln was struggling to do that. And one of the groups of people that he realized that he needed was people who were opposed to slavery, as he was, but also were opposed to foreigners, immigrants. They had a real problem, and this is not even about illegal immigration. This was immigrants, period. And Lincoln thought their ideas were terrible. He said if they ever got into power, he'd rather move to Russia, where they didn't pretend to be free, which is an amazing line. But he needed their votes, because you need a majority to win in a democracy. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, when we look for lessons in history, it would seem obvious that pandering would be a tool in a politician's toolbox, and that insulting voters would be something you'd want to avoid.
Yeah.
But then you look recently, the line about deplorables, or even in this last election when voters were feeling the pain of prices, and we got lectures and lessons about, well, inflation is global, instead of people looking for a little relief. I wonder if those lessons apply today.
Well, I think Democrats are thinking about that now. Should they have approached things a little bit differently? And I think you know politics really well. You know that a lot of professional Democrats, a lot of candidates did try more inclusive approaches, but maybe not everybody, maybe not the loudest voices in the Democratic Party. They were trying to, I think, make moral statements, or look at politics almost like epidemiology. We have to close off the people with the bad ideas. And that turned out not to work. And strangely enough, the guy who didn't seem that inclusive, Donald Trump, was a little bit better, very slightly better, at building a coalition in 2024 and brought a few more people into his tent that people didn't expect him to get.
I like that you mentioned that, because he does something, I think he taps into at least a part of Lincoln's work here, in that he taps into that self-interest.
Yeah.
America first.
Yeah.
This is what's in it for you.
Yeah.
And you highlight so many times here how Lincoln dangles what's in it for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Lincoln we think of as a moral man, speaking of high principle, and that is true. But he also understood that in order to win in politics, he needed to put it in terms of what was in it for them. He had a special problem. Think about this for a minute. He wants to end slavery. Obviously, the people who are most interested in that are people who are enslaved, and none of them can vote. In fact, very few free black people could vote at all. So he's appealing to effectively a 100% white electorate and trying to persuade them that there's something in it for them to oppose slavery. One of the many things that he did was basically say the slave interests are against you, and they're going to spread slavery to your free state, and it's going to affect you. It's going to be bad for you, and that's why you need to be here with me. He was always thinking of that higher principle, but he thought about the other person, the person he was trying to persuade, and why they would even care.
It reminds me of one of the more callous comments I heard from a politician once, who was just sort of making an offhand remark that the problem for advocating for people who live in poverty is that they don't cut very big checks. So I think they were thinking about it in an inverse way about how it affected them.
Yeah.
You write that Lincoln spent little time urging charity or benevolence for enslaved people. You just referred to that. Instead, he said black workers were denied their equal right to be paid for their labor, which white voters could relate to because they wanted fair pay for theirs. It was just that we're all in it together thing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. He didn't look at it as charity for black people. He looked at it as a matter of equality. And you realize that that's why it's one of the most powerful principles in American life and in American politics. You can argue for voters to help someone else, and they might be interested or might not. But you can say equality is what's important here, and then everybody can understand, or maybe a majority can understand what's in it for them.
So self-interest over sermons. Another famous book about Lincoln is titled, famously, of course, after his assembly of that team of rivals. You highlight some of the other people whose views Lincoln didn't necessarily hold himself, but they weren't merely casual or transactional allies. These were close friends of his.
Yeah.
Joseph Gillespie.
Yeah,
from the area here.
Joseph Gillespie, who was just across the river, you're saying, who was a nativist. He was opposed to immigration to the country, had a problem with Irish immigrants, had a problem with Catholics especially.
He was a know-nothing.
He was a know-nothing, as they would say in those years. And Lincoln, as we said, found those views repugnant. But Gillespie was his friend of 20 years.
He tried to get him elected.
And he's like, Joe, I need your help. I really need your help in the 1858 Senate race. And Lincoln appeared with this nativist on stage, which is a thing people might be embarrassed to do today. He did not parrot the guy's views. He tried not to pander to voters, but he talked about the thing that they had in common, which was an opposition to slavery.
Yeah, they share one of my favorite stories of a young Lincoln at the Illinois State House when they jumped out that window, and you write about that too. I love that part. One critic read your book and came away with the impression that Lincoln was, in his words, America's Machiavelli. Mm-hmm. I was really curious to ask you, what do you think of that comparison?
Wow, that makes him sound cynical.
It does.
And
duplicitous
on some level, yeah, it's kind of true. I mean, he had this reputation as Honest Abe. He didn't go around lying, that's for sure. But he would be careful about what he said. He would only say the things that he thought would be effective. In a campaign, he would only focus on the issue that he thought would be decisive. In a conversation, if people asked uncomfortable questions, whatever they said would suddenly remind him of a funny story, and he would just push the conversation off the rails, and they would never get back to the question he didn't want to answer. He was a very cagey guy.
It's like that person who sits down with their therapist, and the therapist tells them, maybe you use humor as a deflection tactic, and then they respond with telling a joke.
Exactly.
Lincoln did that with voters.
Yeah.
He was also strategic, calculating, slow. In this information age, I think our society is wired to want decisive action from our leaders quickly.
Yes.
And you described him as someone who practiced slothful deliberation.
That's what he was accused of by Frederick Douglass, because he took so long to get around to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln was living in an age that we can relate to because the news was speeding up, communications were speeding up, telegraph wires were spreading around the country, daily newspapers were becoming common, and people were being forced to deal with information coming at them at a greater and greater speed. And I think it affected their politics just as it affects ours today. But he did try to reflect on things, and he took pride in the idea that he might take a long time to come to his conclusion, but once he had decided on a course of action, he would never waver from it.
You mentioned Frederick Douglass. Of course, there's also John C. Fremont, who wanted him to free slaves faster, who was stationed here in St. Louis. Ulysses S. Grant, stationed here in St. Louis. Joseph Gillespie, we mentioned him. Elijah Lovejoy in Alton. Dred and Harriet Scott had ties to St. Louis. So there's so many characters in your book that have deep roots here in St. Louis. I really appreciate that you're here to promote your book in this city in particular. But I really love this speed and slow deliberation question, the pace of fighting for liberation, truly. Aren't we too impatient for that kind of delay today?
Oh, gosh, I think we are really impatient. I think that we collectively, and I mean, I'm part of the problem sometimes too, I would suppose. We don't always understand how
I don't even know if it's a problem.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think it might be in that we don't always understand how the government works. The government is built to have conflict and to move slowly and resolve things slowly, and we want instant answers. And we've kind of been trained by our phones and other devices to demand instant answers because someone or something is going to demand our attention 1 second from now. And I do think there is value in the longer thought and the more careful look at things. I think it's one of the reasons that we're so divided. If you spend time listening to someone who has what you think are crazy ideas, when you're done listening, you may still think their ideas are crazy. They may not change your mind. Lincoln's mind was not often changed, but you might understand a little better where they're coming from. In the same way that you may be, if your mother or your brother has different politics than you're pretty sure they're wrong, but you love them and understand them a little more fully. When you take a little more time with people, you get a little bit better what your common humanity is or your common citizenship is.
Yeah, you've strained and flexed some important muscles along that exercise. In your book, you write about some of these speeches in Alton, just across the river here from St. Louis, where Lincoln told voters they could, quote, put slavery on the road to extinction without having to think about racial equality in their day-to-day lives. That was a decision for later. How do we square that strategic patience with Dr. King's message of the urgency of now?
Well, that is part of the challenge of Lincoln's story. And Lincoln was confronted with Frederick Douglass, who was always prodding him and saying, you're moving too slow, you're moving too slow. And they finally had a meeting, which is one of my meetings described in the book, these face-to-face meetings that the story is about, in which Douglass confronted him about black soldiers in the Civil War being treated unequally. And Lincoln clearly knew that was wrong, but also said, I face certain political realities and I'm dealing with them. And Douglass came away thinking that is reasonable. I think both of those things are necessary to make a better country. You need someone to say, this is the problem and we need a solution and don't be putting me off. But you also need someone who is practical to say, I need to build a majority, and building a majority takes time.
Interesting indeed. At the end of our program every week, we like to check the record, and we take something that's happening now and compare it back to history. I love that there were so many examples of that in your book. You've already referenced one of them in our conversation here, where Lincoln joked if the wrong party were to win, he'd move out of the country and go to Russia. That's something people do today. There's a conversation about birthright citizenship happening now. That was relevant back then with James Buchanan and all of that in the slavery conversation. You mentioned the pressure of shifting demographics that workers and voters felt and feared back then. That's happening now. And even a reference when Lincoln said the Dred Scott decision, the judge ruled on facts which are not really true. You can call that the alternative facts or the fake news debate. So there's so many things.
Lincoln was protesting a Supreme Court decision, although ultimately he didn't actively oppose that. As president, he did have some problems with the Supreme Court. It's amazing the patterns and the way that they're consistent. Times have changed, the technology has changed, human nature is basically the same, and our political system is basically the same. We've still got these checks and balances, this separation of powers, this same republic, and when you go back into the history, you learn a lot that feels relevant to the present, which is why it's great you do this segment.
So I wonder, my last question for you, the main thrust or gist of your book, Differ We Must, is it hopeful? Is it a cautionary tale? Is it a warning?
Wow. Let me think about that. People listen to me and say, wow, you're hopeful as you talk about these terrible things. I'm not even sure what I'm hopeful about, but I'm trying to describe. I'm trying to understand. I guess it's hopeful for me because I felt that in taking a long look, a more thoughtful look at Lincoln, this character that I'd thought about my whole life, but really getting into how he did what he did, I felt that I understood better how he thought about human nature, how he thought about his job, how he thought about managing people, and it's ended up affecting the way that I think about the people around me today or deal with people in my life. You need to think about the other person and how the other person sees the world, even if you're convinced that they're wrong, and there may be some value in that interaction, even if you're never going to really agree.
Your subtitle is How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America, and I think we can tell by reading your work and hearing you today, hearing your interviews, that you're a journalist succeeding in a divided America. So thanks for joining us,
Thank you.
Steve Inskeep, and we appreciate your time with us.
Glad to do it.